The pale blue gown fit perfectly. Sophia Ashford stood before the mirror in her chamber and examined the woman looking back at her. It had been 1 year since she had worn anything but black. 1 year of mourning clothes, of widow's weeds, of the uniform of grief. Tonight, she was wearing colour again. The gown was elegant without being ostentatious. Pale blue silk with ivory lace at the throat and wrists. It was not the gown of a debutante. It was the gown of a woman who understood her own value. A woman who was no longer entirely defined by loss. "You look beautiful, ma'am," Margaret said from across the room, where she was arranging the final pins in Sophia's hair. "Mr. Whitmore will be quite taken." Sophia did not respond to this. Mr. Whitmore, a respectable widower with modest fortune and kind eyes, had made his intentions clear over the past several months. He had been patient. He had been respectful. He had, in the careful way that society demanded, suggested that he would not be opposed to a deeper acquaintance. Tonight, at the Valentine's ball, he would likely make a more formal offer. She had not yet decided if she would refuse him. "The diamond earrings," Sophia said, and Margaret retrieved them from the jewel box. Small, elegant, appropriate for a widow beginning to rejoin society. The diamonds caught the candlelight as Margaret fastened them. This was who Sophia had become in the past year. A woman who could wear pale blue. A woman who could attend balls. A woman who could consider the prospect of remarriage with something other than despair. It had taken months of deliberate effort, but she had managed it. She had mourned. She had grieved. And finally, she had accepted. This was her life now. A life without Henry. A life she was learning to build alone. 2 years ago, she had met him at a ball, very much like tonight. He had asked her to dance. She had said yes. And everything after that had been inevitable. She did not allow herself to think about him on Valentine's. There was a knock at the chamber door. "Enter," Sophia said, expecting Margaret to return with the final preparations. Instead, a different servant appeared, one of the household staff, looking uncertain. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," the servant said. "A delivery has arrived. The messenger said it was urgent that you receive it before you depart for the ball." Sophia turned from the mirror. "A delivery? From whom?" "The messenger would not say, ma'am. He said only that you would understand once you saw it." The servant held out a small object, a card, cream-coloured and elegant, sealed with red wax. Sophia's hand moved to take it almost without her volition. The card was heavier than expected. The wax seal was pristine, unbroken. And even before she opened it, something in her chest began to tighten in a way she did not understand. She said to the servant, who bowed and departed. Margaret watched from across the room, her expression curious. "A Valentine, ma'am? From Mr. Whitmore, perhaps?" "Perhaps," Sophia said, though her hands were trembling as she examined the seal. The wax was high quality. The envelope bore her name, simply, Sophia. But it was the handwriting that made her breath catch, a particular slant, a specific curve to the letters that belonged to someone she had not seen in 1 year, someone she had not expected to see again. It could not be. She broke the seal. The wax crumbled, and she opened the card. Inside, the message was brief, just a few lines, written in that same familiar hand. The Italian countryside, the pale blue dress. The moment I knew, I have not forgotten. She could not feel her legs. She could not feel anything except the sensation of the world tilting, of reality fragmenting into impossible pieces. "Ma'am?" Margaret crossed the room quickly, catching Sophia's arm before she could collapse. "What is it? What has happened?" Sophia could not speak. She could only stare at where the card had fallen, at the words, so few, so cryptic, and yet so unmistakably familiar. That handwriting, that particular way of forming the letters, that was the handwriting, she whispered. "Margaret, look at it. That handwriting." She could not finish, could not say his name, could not acknowledge what her eyes were telling her, what every nerve in her body was screaming. That this card was written by a hand she thought she would never see again. The hand of her dead husband. Card. We must understand the disappearance. Before we can believe in resurrection, we must understand death. Before we can hope, we must understand loss. Let us go back 2 years. Let us understand how Sophia and Henry met. Let us understand the year they had together before everything changed. And let us understand what happened on that day when he simply ceased to exist. Subscribe if you like to listen to my stories. If this moment speaks to you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what you would do if the impossible became real. Now, let us go back to Sophia's story. The Harrington ballroom was precisely what a Valentine's ball ought to be, excessive in its elegance, uncompromising in its devotion to romance. Red roses climbed every column. Candlelight cast everything in a warm, flattering glow. The orchestra played music that seemed designed to make people feel as though their ordinary lives were actually part of something larger, something more beautiful, something that mattered. Sophia Ashford had come to the ball with her mother, as was proper. She was 23 years old, accomplished on the piano, fluent in French, and possessed of a modest dowry and considerable patience. She had attended 13 Valentine's balls in her life. This was, she expected, going to be very much like all the others. She had not anticipated meeting anyone who would matter. They had separated almost immediately upon arrival, her mother to the chairs where older women positioned themselves to observe and judge, Sophia to drift through the rooms with her friend Charlotte, who was far more interested in securing a dancing partner than Sophia was. Charlotte had been married 6 months prior and had begun the process of introducing unmarried women to eligible men with the fervour of someone who had discovered a new religion. "There is someone you should meet," Charlotte had said, gesturing toward a gentleman in conversation near the refreshment table. The second son of Lord Ashford, considerable fortune despite the birth order, entirely respectable. "And, no," Sophia said gently. "Charlotte, I came to look at the paintings. Lord Harrington has recently acquired several Italian landscapes. I would very much like to examine them." Charlotte looked at Sophia with the particular exasperation of a woman who had recently married and could no longer understand why others did not view marriage as the primary object of existence. "You came to look at paintings," Charlotte repeated, "at a Valentine's ball, where men are expressly gathering to court women." "I came to do both," Sophia said, already moving toward the gallery that Lord Harrington had opened for the occasion. "I am capable of appreciating art and remaining open to social interaction simultaneously." And so she had found herself alone, or rather, in the comfortable solitude of a crowd, standing before a painting of the Italian countryside. It was a landscape, rolling hills rendered in soft greens and golds, a small village nestled in the distance, cypress trees standing like sentinels against a pale blue sky. It was beautiful in the way that paintings of places you have never visited can be beautiful. They represent possibility. They suggest that the world extends far beyond your current circumstances. Sophia was so entirely absorbed in the painting that she did not immediately notice the man who had entered the gallery, did not notice him until he had moved close enough that she became aware of his presence through some almost imperceptible shift in the air around her. "It is Tuscany," he said quietly, "the region where the painting is set. I spent 3 months there, in the village near where this was painted. It is not quite as beautiful as the painting suggests, and also far more beautiful. The light there is unlike anything you see in England." Sophia turned to look at him. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that suggested intelligence, a face that seemed to be always thinking about something. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years her senior, dressed in formal evening attire that fit him perfectly. There was something about him that suggested he was not entirely comfortable at a Valentine's ball, though he conducted himself with the precision of someone who understood the rules, even if he found them tedious. "Have you travelled to Italy?" Sophia asked. "I have," he said. "Have you?" "No," Sophia admitted, "though I should very much like to. Italy seems to contain everything that is missing from England." He smiled at this, a genuine smile, not the practiced one that gentlemen usually employed in social situations. "I am Henry Ashford," he said, "though I should tell you immediately that despite the name, I am not the man your friend Charlotte was attempting to interest you in. That would be my cousin. I am the third son, which means my fortune is considerably less impressive, and my prospects considerably fewer." "I am Sophia Ashford," she replied, "and I was not attempting to be introduced to anyone. I came specifically to see the paintings." "Then I am interrupting your solitude under false pretenses," Henry said, though he made no movement to leave. "I came to escape the insufferable noise of the ballroom. I did not expect to find a woman of taste hidden away in the gallery." They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes, about Italy, about art, about books, about the peculiar experience of attending social events while finding oneself entirely at odds with their purpose. It had been the most natural conversation Sophia could remember having with a man she had only just met. There had been no performance in it, no careful negotiation of appropriate topics, no sense that either of them was playing a part. And then Henry had said, "I would like to dance with you, if you would permit it, though I feel obligated to warn you that I am a terrible dancer, and your feet may suffer considerable damage in the process." "I should like to dance with you," Sophia had said, surprising herself with her boldness, "though I feel obligated to warn you that I do not suffer fools gladly, and you may find yourself quite exhausted by my critical assessment." Oh, he had laughed, genuinely laughed, and took her hand to lead her back to the ballroom. The dance itself was unremarkable. He was indeed a somewhat awkward dancer, though not terrible. She found herself amused by his absolute refusal to maintain the serious expression that most gentlemen did during formal dances. He was smiling at her the entire time, as though they shared a private joke, as though, in the midst of a crowded ballroom, they were the only two people who truly understood that all of this, the roses, the candles, the orchestra, the elaborate ritual of courtship, was slightly absurd, and beautiful precisely because of that absurdity. When the dance ended, he had asked if he might call upon her. She had given him her address, and he had taken her hand and held it for perhaps a moment longer than propriety permitted, and looked at her with an expression that suggested he could see her, not the version of her that appeared in drawing rooms, but the actual woman underneath. He had said nothing. He did not need to say anything. Everything after that had been inevitable. They had married in the spring, in a quiet ceremony that had satisfied both families' requirements, while maintaining the kind of privacy that suited them both. Sophia had worn a gown of ivory silk, not white, something elegant but not ceremonial. Henry had said she looked like a painting come to life, and she had believed him because he had said it in a particular way that suggested he was not performing gallantry, but stating a simple fact. The year that followed was the kind of year that shapes a life. They had rented a townhouse in London, modest but elegant, in a neighbourhood that was respectable without being fashionable. Henry had established himself in his work, soliciting, a profession that required both intellect and integrity. Sophia had discovered that she was remarkably happy managing a household without the intrusion of parents or family expectations. They had entertained quietly. They had walked through London. They had read to each other in the evenings. They had loved each other in the ways that matter, with attention, with genuine interest, with the kind of physical affection that comes from actually desiring the person you are with, rather than merely performing the duties of marriage. If Sophia had been asked, during those 12 months, to describe her life, she would have said, "I am happy," not the effusive theatrical happiness that society expected women to perform, but a genuine, quiet contentment. She had found her person. She had built her life with someone who saw her clearly and loved her anyway, or rather, loved her because she was herself, and no one else. And then, on a Tuesday morning in February, 1 year after they had met, 13 months after they had married, everything changed in the span of seconds. Henry had dressed for an appointment, a matter of business, he had said. He would be back by evening. He had kissed her as he left, a kiss that was no different from any other kiss, except that it was, in fact, the last kiss she would ever receive from him, though neither of them knew that at the time. By Wednesday evening, he had not returned. By Thursday morning, when the constables came to the door with their official expressions and their refusal to provide an explanation, Sophia understood that something catastrophic had occurred, but she did not understand what. The officer in charge, a man named Constable Hartley, with the kind of bureaucratic manner that suggested he had delivered bad news so many times it had become routine, had asked to speak to her privately. She had taken him to the drawing room. He had removed his hat and held it in his hands with an awkwardness that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with what he was about to say. "Mrs. Ashford," he had begun, "your husband was taken into custody yesterday morning. There are charges against him of a serious nature. I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics at this time, but you should understand that the matter is quite grave." Sophia had not understood. She had asked questions that Constable Hartley could not or would not answer. Where was he? Could she see him? What were the charges? When would he return home? None of her questions had been answered. The constable had simply told her that she would be contacted if the matter proceeded to trial. Until then, she was advised to remove herself from society. The scandal he had suggested would be considerable. And then he had left. For 3 days, Sophia had existed in a state of confused agitation. She had written letters to solicitors. She had attempted to visit Henry at whatever facility was holding him, only to be turned away. She had sent messages to his family, to his colleagues, to anyone who might have information. No one could tell her anything. Or rather, everyone told her the same thing. There had been an accusation. It was serious. The evidence was compelling. She should prepare herself for the worst. On the 4th day, a different constable had come to her door. Not Constable Hartley this time, but someone of higher authority. He had been more direct. "Your husband is dead," the man had said without preamble. "He was found in his cell this morning. Suicide, by all appearances." Sophia had not wept. She had not screamed. She had simply stood in her drawing room, in a house that was no longer her home, and understood that she was now a widow, that her marriage, which had lasted barely 13 months, was over, that the man she loved was gone, not removed from her by accident or circumstance, but actively, deliberately removed by his own hand. The constable had offered his condolences. He had suggested that she arrange for his burial. He had told her that no further investigation would be conducted, as the matter was now closed, and he had left her alone. There is a particular kind of silence that follows death. Not the absence of sound, but rather the absence of meaning. People would speak to Sophia, and she would hear them, but the words seemed to come from very far away. They would offer condolences. They would bring food she would not eat. They would suggest, in careful language, that she might want to withdraw from society for an appropriate period of time, as if she had any intention of remaining in society. The first month after Henry's death was a blur of practical details, arranging his burial, settling his affairs, learning from his solicitor that his finances were considerably more modest than she had believed, not poor, but not wealthy either, learning that there were debts, learning that the charges against him, whatever they had been, remained entirely unexplained to her. The constables had refused to provide detail. Henry's family had refused to speak to her. His colleagues had been equally silent. The scandal that Constable Hartley had warned her about had materialized, but not in the way she had expected. Society did not ostracize her for being the wife of an accused criminal. Instead, society simply stopped acknowledging her entirely. Women who had called upon her before his death suddenly found themselves too occupied to visit. Invitations that had been extended before the incident were quietly withdrawn. The world that had accepted her as Henry Ashford's wife decided, without explicitly stating so, that she no longer existed in any meaningful way. She was a widow, but worse, she was a widow whose husband had died in a cell, accused of something no one would discuss. She was radioactive. She was a reminder that terrible things could happen to respectable people, and respectable people preferred not to be reminded of such things. Margaret had stayed. The lady's maid had several times been offered better positions in other households, positions with families of greater standing, with promises of higher wages. Each time she had declined and returned to Sophia's employ. She had never explicitly stated her reasons for staying, but Sophia understood. Margaret had understood, from the beginning, that Henry's death was not the end of a woman's story, but merely a chapter. That Sophia would need someone who believed she would continue existing past this moment of devastation. "You should rest, ma'am," Margaret would say, when she found Sophia staring out windows at nothing in particular. "You should eat something. You should speak with someone. You should allow yourself to grieve properly, instead of standing in corridors looking like a ghost." And Sophia would do these things, or attempt to, because Margaret expected it, and because there was something easier about obeying someone else's expectations than about understanding her own. The second month was the month of questions she could not answer. Why had Henry been accused of whatever crime he had been accused of? He had been a solicitor, a man of law, a man who understood the importance of justice and propriety. The man she had loved would not have committed a crime, but the man she had married had also, apparently, chosen to end his own life in a prison cell rather than face trial, which meant either A. he had committed the crime and chosen death as the more preferable alternative to punishment, or B. he was innocent and had died rather than suffer the humiliation of a trial for something he did not do. Sophia had no way of knowing which was true. She had attempted, in those early weeks, to discover what the charge had been. She had written letters to solicitors. She had attempted to visit the constabulary. She had even considered hiring an investigator to uncover the truth. But with each attempt, she had encountered walls of silence. The matter was closed. Her husband was dead. There was nothing to investigate. And gradually, over weeks and months, she had stopped trying to understand. The not knowing had transformed from something agonizing into something she could almost live with. She did not know why Henry had died. She did not know if he was guilty or innocent. She did not know if his death had been a choice born of despair or a choice born of shame. And because she could not know these things, she had learned to exist in the space where knowing was irrelevant. What mattered was that he was gone. Everything else was secondary to that simple, devastating fact. The third month was the month of anger. It had arrived without warning. She had been reading in the library when it had suddenly crashed over her like a wave. Rage at Henry for leaving her. Rage at whatever circumstance or choice had led to his death. Rage at herself for not understanding him better, for not seeing something coming that he clearly had seen. Rage at society for their silence, their judgment, their refusal to acknowledge her existence. She had broken a teacup that day, simply set it on the floor and watched it shatter. Margaret had come running, alarmed, only to find Sophia sitting in the middle of the drawing room, surrounded by fragments of porcelain, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand," Sophia had said, and the words had come out like a prayer or a curse. "I don't understand what happened. I don't understand why he left me. I don't understand why no one will explain any of it. I don't understand how to exist in a world where the person I love the most does not." Margaret had simply sat beside her and held her hand. She had not offered platitudes or false hope. She had simply been present in the way that only someone who understands real grief can be present. The anger had lasted perhaps 2 weeks, and then, as inexplicably as it had arrived, it had faded, leaving behind only exhaustion. The 4th through 12th months were the months of survival. Sophia had learned, over those 9 months, the mechanics of continuing to exist when the thing that had made existence feel important no longer existed. She had learned to wake up in the morning and drink tea. She had learned to take walks. She had learned to read books, though she rarely retained what they said. She had learned to eat, though food had no taste. She had learned to dress herself in mourning black, which suited her colouring but felt like a costume worn by someone else. She had learned the particular rhythm of grief, the way it would ease for days and make her believe she might be healing, only to crash over her again when she encountered something that reminded her of him. A book he had mentioned reading, a street they had walked together, a song the orchestra played at a distant ball. Each time she had weathered it, each time she had survived it, and gradually, almost without noticing, she had begun to survive longer stretches between those moments of acute pain. By the 6th month, she had stopped counting the days since his death. By the 9th month, she could think about him without weeping. By the 12th month, she could acknowledge that she had survived an entire year without him. It had not made her happy. It had not resolved any of the questions that haunted her. It had not made sense of his death or her survival. But it had changed her in a fundamental way. She had learned that she could exist without the person she loved most, that she could eat and sleep and walk and read, even though the thing that had made those activities feel worthwhile was gone, that survival itself was a kind of victory, even when it felt like simple cowardice. And sometime around the 11th month, something unexpected had happened. She had begun to imagine a future, not a happy future, necessarily, but a future that did not end with his death, a future that extended beyond the mourning period, a future where she might attend balls again, where she might wear colour, where she might permit another man to court her, knowing that whatever she built with that man would never be what she had built with Henry, but might be something she could live with. Mr. Whitmore had appeared in her life around that time, a respectable widower, kind and intelligent, with the particular patience of a man who understood that marriage, the second time, was not a matter of passionate love, but of comfortable companionship. He had not pressed her. He had simply been present, offering his friendship without demanding anything in return. And by the time the 12th month had arrived, Sophia had begun to consider that perhaps she did not need to spend the rest of her life as a widow, that perhaps she could move forward, that perhaps survival was not the same as betrayal, even if it felt that way. She had purchased the pale blue gown in January, not because she believed she was ready to remarry, but because she was ready to acknowledge, if only to herself, that the woman in the mirror was no longer entirely defined by grief, that there were parts of her that existed separate from Henry's death, that she was capable of imagining a life that did not depend upon his existence to justify her own. The Valentine's ball had been meant to be a marker, a moment where she could stand at the threshold between mourning and moving forward and choose to step over it. She had not anticipated that the past would reach forward and pull her back. Margaret did not allow Sophia to remain frozen in shock for long. Within the hour of the Valentine's arrival, the lady's maid had transformed from companion into investigator. She had dispatched household staff to trace the messenger. She had questioned the servants who had received the card. She had examined the envelope, the seal, the paper itself, looking for any detail that might explain how it had come to exist. "The paper is expensive," Margaret had said, turning it over in her hands. "Not the kind of thing a street messenger would carry. This suggests the sender knew they needed quality materials. This was not a hastily written note. This was deliberate." Sophia had simply stared at the card, still unable to fully process what she was seeing. The handwriting, that specific slant to the letters, the way he formed his H with that particular flourish. It was unmistakably his, and yet it was impossible. The messenger, Margaret had continued, her practical mind already moving forward while Sophia remained trapped in shock, was described as a young man, well-dressed, respectable. He came to the servants' entrance with specific instructions: deliver to Mrs. Ashford personally, before she departed for the ball. He did not leave his name. He did not wait for a response. He simply left the card and departed. "Why?" Sophia had whispered. "Why would—" "That is what we must discover," Margaret had said firmly. "If this card is genuine, if it truly was written by your husband, then there are answers to be found, and I intend to find them." The investigation had begun in earnest the following morning. Margaret had dressed in her finest day clothes, clothing that suggested she was someone of some importance, and had made inquiries. Where had the messenger come from? What household had he been employed by? Was there any way to trace his movements? The servants' gossip was, as always, a useful tool. One of the kitchen staff had mentioned that a well-dressed young man had been seen near the house on the morning of the delivery. He had not come through the front entrance, but had appeared, briefly, in the mews. He had spoken to no one, except to ask for specific directions to deliver the package. This suggested planning. This suggested someone who knew the layout of the house, or at least enough of it to navigate delivery without drawing attention. Someone familiar with the property, Margaret reported to Sophia that evening, as they sat in the drawing room with the doors closed. Not a stranger hired for a single task. Someone who understands how deliveries work in a household like this. Or someone who simply took precautions, Sophia said quietly. The shock had worn off slightly, replaced by a kind of numb bewilderment. To avoid being remembered, to avoid being identified. Yes, Margaret agreed. That is also possible. Over the next week, Margaret had expanded her investigation. She had visited the paper merchant who supplied the finest stationery to the households of London's gentry. The proprietor had been reluctant to discuss his clients, but Margaret had been persuasive. She had described the paper, the weight, the particular watermark. He had been able to narrow it down to perhaps a dozen customers. "But ma'am," he had said carefully, "I cannot ethically provide you with names. My clients trust me to maintain their confidentiality." Margaret had understood this. She had also understood, from years of service in great houses, how to navigate around such ethical boundaries without directly violating. She had thanked him and left, but not before noting, with careful precision, which customers had recently made large purchases of fine paper. "We must be cautious," Margaret had told Sophia as she reported her findings, "because if this card is real, if it truly was written by your husband, then there are implications we have not yet considered." "What implications?" Sophia had asked, though she suspected she already knew. "If he wrote this card," Margaret had said slowly, "then he was alive recently enough to do so, which means he did not die in that cell a year ago, which means the constables lied to you, which means nothing," Sophia had interrupted. "It could be a forgery. Someone could have studied his handwriting and replicated it. It could be a cruel trick perpetrated by someone who knows about his death." But even as she said it, she did not believe it. The handwriting was too perfect. The references were too specific. No one could have fabricated a message that contained the precise details he had shared with her. The Italian countryside, the pale blue dress, the exact moment he had realized he loved her. No one could have accessed those intimate memories except Henry himself. "It is not a forgery," Margaret said with certainty. "I have served in this household long enough to understand your husband's handwriting as well as my own. That card was written by his hand, which means he is alive, which means nothing," Sophia repeated, but her voice was breaking. "Because if he is alive, why did he abandon me? Why has he remained absent for an entire year? Why would he allow me to mourn him only to send a cryptic Valentine?" Margaret had no answer to these questions. The breakthrough came on the 9th day after the Valentine's arrival. Margaret had been making inquiries at the postal office, wondering if there was any way to trace where the card had been posted from, when she had encountered an old acquaintance, a woman named Mrs. Collins, who had once worked as a housekeeper in a respectable family and had since taken a position managing correspondence for a law firm. "I heard you were asking about fine paper," Mrs. Collins had said, approaching Margaret as she was leaving the postal office. "And about a young man making deliveries. Is it connected to the Ashford household?" Margaret's heart had begun to race. "What do you know of it?" "Perhaps nothing," Mrs. Collins had said carefully. "But there is a solicitor's office near Lincoln's Inn. They have been employing a young man of respectable appearance for the past several months. He does all their deliveries and errands, and I happened to notice, when visiting the office last week, that they had a fresh supply of very fine paper, the kind used for important correspondence." Margaret had pressed for more information, and Mrs. Collins had provided it reluctantly: the name of the firm, their location, their practice. It was not much, but it was more than Margaret had possessed before. That evening she had reported this discovery to Sophia, and for the first time since the Valentine had arrived, Sophia had felt something other than shock and confusion. She had felt hope. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope. It was the feeling that had sustained her through the initial grief, only to be shattered when she was told Henry was dead. It was the feeling that could destroy her again if she allowed it to flourish and then discovered that it was misplaced. But it was also the feeling that made her understand, suddenly and with terrible clarity, what Margaret had been trying to say all along. "If he is alive," Sophia had whispered, "if he truly is alive, then he did not commit suicide. Which means he was innocent. Which means the crime he was accused of, whatever it was, he did not do." "Yes," Margaret had said quietly. "And if he was innocent," Sophia had continued, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, "then why did the constables tell me he was dead? Why would they lie about something so fundamental?" "That," Margaret had said, "is what we must now discover." The next morning, Margaret had dressed in her finest clothes again, and this time she had brought Sophia's jewellery box. "We are going to visit this law firm," Margaret had said with the air of someone who has moved past asking permission and into the realm of simply informing. "And we are going to ask them directly about the young man they employ. If they ask why we are inquiring, we will tell them a partial truth, that we are attempting to locate someone who may have information about a matter of significant personal importance." "Margaret," Sophia had said, "they will not speak to us. We are women. We are strangers. They will turn us away." "Perhaps," Margaret had agreed, "but we will not know unless we attempt it. And Sophia, I know what I saw when you opened that card. I know what you saw. That was your husband's handwriting. That was his voice. And if he is alive, if he has been alive all this time, then you deserve to know why. You deserve to understand what happened." Sophia had wanted to protest. She had wanted to insist that hope was dangerous, that investigation would only lead to heartbreak, that it was better to accept that Henry was dead and attempt to move forward. But she had also wanted, with an intensity that had frightened her, to know the truth. So she had allowed Margaret to fasten the jewellery, to arrange her hair, to dress her in clothing that suggested respectable standing, and together they had departed for Lincoln's Inn. The law firm of Brennan and Associates was housed in a narrow building near the courts, its windows overlooking the street where barristers and solicitors hurried about their business. A clerk had greeted them at the door with the particular disdain that professional men reserve for women who appear in places where women have no business appearing. "We are not accepting new clients," he had said firmly. "If you have a legal matter, I can provide you with the names of other firms." "We do not have a legal matter," Margaret had interrupted, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from someone who has spent years managing households. and understands how to project confidence despite having no actual standing. We are attempting to locate someone. We have reason to believe a young man in your employ may have information about this person's whereabouts." The clerk had been skeptical, but Margaret had been persuasive. She had provided just enough detail to suggest that the matter was serious, without revealing what the matter actually was. She had mentioned, delicately, that it concerned a man of some standing who had been absent from his family for an extended period. She had suggested that the firm's young messenger might have inadvertently encountered him. "If you could simply provide his name," Margaret had said, "we could pursue the matter independently and not trouble your firm further." The clerk had wavered. He had clearly not been authorized to speak with strange women about the firm's employees, but he had also recognized that Margaret was not going to depart without some kind of answer. "The young man you are inquiring about," he had said finally, "I cannot provide personal information about our employees without authorization from Mr. Brennan himself. However, if you were to wait, I could inquire whether Mr. Brennan is available to receive you." And with that, Margaret and Sophia had been shown to a small waiting room where they had sat in near silence for what had felt like an eternity, watching the clock and wondering if they were about to discover that their hope was justified or if they were about to suffer another devastating disappointment. Mr. Brennan was a man of perhaps 60, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating the complexities of law and human nature. His office was lined with law books, his desk organized with the precision of a man who understood that order was the foundation of justice. He had studied Sophia and Margaret for a long moment after they were shown into his office, as though he were reading something written in their faces. "You have come about Mr. Henry Ashford," he had said. It was not a question. Sophia's breath had caught. She had not provided his name. She had been deliberately vague, allowing Mr. Brennan to make assumptions about who they were seeking. "Yes," Margaret had said, when it became clear that Sophia could not speak. "We have." Mr. Brennan had risen from his desk and moved to the window, his back to them. When he spoke again, his voice had been careful, as though he were choosing each word with deliberate precision. "Mr. Ashford is no longer employed by this firm," he had said. "However, his service to us over the past year has been exemplary. He is a man of considerable integrity and intelligence. I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics of his employment, but I can tell you this. He has been instrumental in uncovering a matter of significant legal and moral importance." "He is alive," Sophia had whispered. Mr. Brennan had turned to face her then, and his expression had softened slightly. "Yes, Mrs. Ashford, your husband is alive, and I suspect you have many questions about why you were told he was not." The story that Mr. Brennan had told them over the next hour had been the kind of story that reads like fiction, too dramatic, too perfectly structured to be true, and yet every detail had the weight of absolute authenticity. Henry had been working on a case, Mr. Brennan had explained, investigating allegations of corruption within the metropolitan. There had been evidence suggesting that a high-ranking constable, a man named Harrow, who held considerable authority, had been using his position to extort money from individuals, threatening arrest on false charges if they did not comply. Henry had been the solicitor assigned to defend one of Harrow's victims, and in the course of that work, he had uncovered a pattern, multiple false accusations, multiple individuals who had suddenly disappeared or withdrawn their complaints, multiple cases that had been mysteriously closed without trial. "Your husband was a thorough man," Mr. Brennan had said. He began investigating beyond his assigned case. He discovered that Constable Harrow had been running a systematic extortion ring for nearly 5 years, that he had destroyed lives, that he had fabricated evidence, that he had used his authority to silence anyone who threatened his operation. Henry had brought his findings to his own firm and to the appropriate authorities, but when he had attempted to formalize a complaint against Harrow, something had shifted. Suddenly, Henry himself had been accused of a serious crime, embezzlement from a client, a charge that was entirely fabricated. "Your husband understood immediately what was happening," Mr. Brennan had continued. "Harrow had allies within the constabulary. They were framing him to silence him. They were removing the one person who had gathered enough evidence to expose their corruption." "And the suicide?" Margaret had asked quietly. The constable told Mrs. Ashford that her husband had taken his own life in his cell. "A fiction," Mr. Brennan had said, "designed to protect your husband and to allow us to work. You see, Henry had come to me with his suspicions about Harrow before the false arrest occurred. We had already begun working together. unofficially, to gather additional evidence. When he was arrested, it was not entirely unexpected, and when we informed him that you had been told he had died, it was a deliberate choice. Sophia had felt as though she could not breathe. You told him I had been told he was dead. Yes, Mr. Brennan had said, and there had been genuine regret in his voice. It was cruel, but it was also necessary. You see, had your husband attempted to contact you, had he given any indication that he was alive, Harrow's people would have used you as leverage. They would have threatened you. They would have used you to silence him. The only way to protect you was to ensure that you genuinely believed him to be dead, that your grief was real, that there was nothing they could threaten you with. The cruelty of it had been breathtaking. An entire year, mourning, grief that had broken her, and all of it necessary to protect her from men who would have used her as a weapon. What happened to him? Sophia had asked. After his arrest, how? He was never actually imprisoned, Mr. Brennan had explained. That was part of the fiction. He was taken to a location under my supervision, where he worked with investigators to build an irrefutable case against Harrow. It was tedious, painstaking work. It required him to remain hidden, to avoid any contact with you, to maintain the fiction that he was dead. And now, Margaret had asked. And now, Mr. Brennan had said, the case is concluded. Constable Harrow has been arrested. The evidence against him is overwhelming. Your husband's name has been formally cleared. The false charges have been expunged from the record. He is no longer in danger. He is free, Sophia had whispered. Yes, Mr. Brennan had confirmed. He is free. And he has instructed me to tell you that he will be returning to you on Valentine's Day, that he chose that date deliberately because it is the day you met, that he has spent every day of this past year remembering that moment, the painting, the pale blue dress, the moment he realized that you were the only remarkable thing in the room, and that he is coming home. The moment had stretched and stretched, encompassing the entirety of the year she had mourned him, all the nights she had wept, all the days she had forced herself to continue existing, all the moments when she had believed she would never see him again, all of it compressed into the space of understanding that he had been alive, that he had been suffering his own kind of imprisonment, that every choice that had been made, every lie, every separation, every moment of cruel silence had been made to protect her. He is coming home, she had repeated, and the words had sounded impossible even as she said them. Yes, Mr. Brennan had said. He has asked me to tell you that he understands if you no longer wish to see him, that the year of separation, the year of believing him to be dead, may have changed you in ways that mean you cannot return to what you were, that he would understand if you chose to move forward with another life, but that he is coming home regardless, to prove to you that what you had together was real, that it was worth the price he has paid to protect it. Sophia and Margaret had left Miss Brennan's office in a state that could only be described as shock. They had not spoken during the carriage ride home. There had been nothing to say that could encompass the magnitude of what they had learned. Henry was alive. He had not abandoned her. He had been protecting her. Every lie, every moment of cruelty in the silence had been an act of love. It was almost impossible to comprehend. When they arrived at the townhouse, Sophia had gone directly to her chamber. She had sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the Valentine card, still lying on her dressing table, where she had left it, the Italian countryside, the pale blue dress. The moment I knew. I have not forgotten. I am coming home. He had been thinking of her. During an entire year of hiding, of working to expose corruption and protect himself from enemies, of being unable to contact her or explain himself, he had been thinking of that moment. He had been holding it close. He had been waiting for the moment when he could return to her and reclaim what they had lost. Margaret had entered the chamber without knocking. He is coming back, the lady's maid had said quietly. The question now is, what will you do when he arrives? And that, Sophia had understood, was the question she would have to answer. Because the year of mourning had changed her. She was not the woman he had left behind. She had learned to exist without him. She had imagined a future without him. She had begun the process of moving forward. She could not simply return to who she had been before. She could not undo the transformation that loss had imposed upon her. But perhaps, she had thought, looking at the card in her hands, perhaps transformation did not need to mean the end of love. Perhaps it meant something more complex. Perhaps it meant learning to love someone who had been stolen from you and then returned. Perhaps it meant building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Perhaps, when Henry returned, they would not be the people they had been before, but they could be people who understood, finally and completely, what it meant to choose each other, not because passion demanded it, but because they had been tested and survived and chosen, despite everything, to come home to each other. "He is coming back," Sophia had repeated, and this time it had sounded like a prayer. He arrived on Valentine's Day at 3:30 in the afternoon. Sophia had spent the morning in a state of controlled hysteria. She had changed her dress 4 times. She had arranged and rearranged her hair. She had paced the drawing room until Margaret had finally insisted that she sit down before she wore a path into the carpet. "He will come," Margaret had said with the certainty of someone who had already accepted this as fact. "And when he does, you will either embrace him or you will not. Either way, you will survive it. You have survived worse." The knock on the door had come as a surprise despite the fact that Sophia had been waiting for it for 6 days. She had heard the carriage arrive. She had heard the servants opening the door. She had heard a man's voice, familiar and yet strange, as though she had heard it in dreams so many times that the reality of it was almost unrecognizable. Margaret had gone to greet him. Sophia had remained in the drawing room, her heart beating so forcefully that she thought it might break through her ribs. And then he had appeared in the doorway. Henry was thinner than she remembered. There was a weariness around his eyes that had not been there before. His hair had streaks of grey that she did not recall, though that might have simply been a function of the lighting in the drawing room. He was wearing a dark coat, well tailored, but not quite as fine as the ones he had worn before. His hands, when he held them at his sides, were trembling slightly. They had stared at each other across the space of the drawing room, a distance of perhaps 10 feet, though it felt like an ocean. "Sophia," he had said, and her name in his mouth had sounded like both a question and a prayer. She had not been able to speak. She had not been able to move. She had simply stood and stared at the man she had mourned, trying to reconcile the memory of him with the reality of his presence. "I understand if you do not wish to see me," he had continued, and his voice had held the particular brokenness of someone who has prepared himself for the worst and is almost expecting it. "I understand if the year of separation has changed what you feel. I understand if you have decided to move forward with—" She had crossed the space between them without conscious decision. Her body had simply moved while her mind remained frozen. She had reached him and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating beneath her palm. "You are real," she had whispered. "I am real," he had confirmed. "I am sorry. I am so profoundly sorry for what I have put you through. There is no apology sufficient for a year of mourning, but Sophia, I am sorry." "Okay." And then she had been weeping, not the quiet tears of grief that had characterized her mourning, but deep, shaking sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being. He had held her, and she had felt the solidness of him, the reality of him, and understood that some part of her had never entirely believed he was dead. Some part of her had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had moved to the sofa without discussing it. He had kept his arm around her, as though he was afraid that if he released her she might disappear. She had held his hand, studying it as though she had never seen it before, cataloguing the way his fingers looked, the familiar callus on his right index finger from holding pens, the line that creased his palm. "Tell me," she had said finally when she could speak. "Tell me everything." And so he had. He had told her about the case, about Constable Harrow and the systematic extortion, about the false arrest and the hidden year of investigation, about the moment when Mr. Brennan had told him that Sophia had been informed of his death. "I wanted to contact you," Henry had said, and there had been anguish in his voice. "Every moment of every day I wanted to send you a message, to let you know I was alive. But they were watching, Harrow's people. If I had attempted to communicate with you, they would have used you. They would have threatened you. And I could not—" His voice had broken. "I could not bear the thought of you being used against me. So you allowed me to believe you were dead," Sophia had said quietly. "Yes. And I understand if that is something you cannot forgive." She had not responded immediately. The anger that she might have felt had been subsumed by a more complex emotion. Understanding mingled with pain. She understood why he had done it. She understood that it had been done to protect her. But understanding did not erase the year of suffering. Understanding did not undo the transformation that grief had imposed upon her. "I have changed," she had said finally. "The year you were gone, I was not simply mourning. I was surviving. I was learning to exist without you. I was beginning to imagine a future that did not include you. And I cannot simply return to who I was before." "I do not expect you to," Henry had said. "I do not even know who you were before anymore. And I certainly am not the man I was before. We have both been tested and transformed. The question is whether we can rebuild from that transformation." "Can we?" Sophia had asked. "Can we actually return to what we had?" Henry had been quiet for a long moment. Then he had said, "I do not think we can return, but I think we might be able to build something different, something that is aware of what we have lost, something stronger perhaps, because it knows how fragile love can be." The days that followed were strange and difficult in ways that neither of them had anticipated. Henry had not returned to their home permanently at first. He had taken rooms nearby, visiting during the day, but returning to his lodgings at night. It had been a deliberate choice, giving Sophia space, allowing her time to adjust to his presence without overwhelming her. But it had also been necessary, because being together was exhausting in a way that they had not expected. They had so much to say to each other, and yet words were often inadequate to express what needed to be expressed. There would be moments of profound tenderness, followed by moments of equally profound awkwardness. Sophia had wanted to know the details of his year in hiding, but when he had attempted to tell her about the work, about the evidence gathering, about the danger he had been in, she had found herself overwhelmed, not by the information, but by the realization of how close he had come to not returning at all. Henry had wanted to hear about her year of mourning, but when she had described the paralysis of grief, the difficulty of moving forward, the point at which she had begun to consider remarriage, he had struggled to contain his reaction. "Mr. Whitmore?" he had asked, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge of something sharp beneath it. "He was kind," Sophia had said. "He was patient. He did not rush me. He simply offered his companionship when I needed it most." "And you considered marrying him?" "Yes," Sophia had said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I did, because I believed you were dead, Henry, and a widow cannot remain a widow forever without becoming a cautionary tale. I was attempting to build a life." He seemed like a reasonable path forward. Henry had been quiet. Then he had said, "I understand, and I do not blame you. But Sophia, I need you to understand that I spent an entire year waiting for you. I spent it holding on to the memory of who you were, of what we had. I did it to survive. And I spent a year learning to let you go," Sophia had replied, "to accept that you were gone, to rebuild myself as someone who could exist without you. You cannot expect me to instantly abandon that transformation simply because you have returned." This had been perhaps the most honest conversation they had, and also one of the most painful, because it had required them both to acknowledge that the year of separation had created a divide that love alone could not bridge. They loved each other. That much had not changed, but they had changed, and those changes could not be undone. It was Margaret who had finally suggested the solution. "You are trying to return to what you were," she had said to them both, one evening when Henry was visiting, and the tension between them had become almost visible. "But that is not possible. You cannot return. You can only move forward, and moving forward means accepting that you are different people than you were when he left." "How do we do that?" Sophia had asked. "You learn each other again," Margaret had said simply. "You do not assume that you know what the other person will do, or feel, or think. You ask, you listen, you rebuild your marriage from the foundation, with the understanding that the foundation has shifted." And so they had attempted to do that. Henry had moved back into the townhouse, not into their old shared chamber, but into a separate room, until they were both ready for more intimacy. They had taken walks through London together, pointing out places that held memories, sharing what those memories meant to them now, in their transformed state. They had talked about the future, about what Henry would do for work. Mr. Brennan had offered him a permanent position at the firm, one that would pay well and allow him to continue the kind of work that had consumed his year in hiding. About whether Sophia wanted to remain in the townhouse or move somewhere new, somewhere without the ghosts of the year they had lived together before. About children, whether they still wanted them, or whether the trauma had changed their desires. About trust. about what it meant to trust someone who had, however necessarily, allowed you to suffer for a year. 2 months after Henry's return, Sophia had finally asked the question that had been haunting her since the beginning. "Do you regret it?" she had asked. "The choice to let me believe you were dead? Looking back, knowing how much pain it caused me, do you regret it?" They had been sitting in the drawing room on a spring evening. The windows were open, letting in the smell of the garden that was beginning to green after. Henry had taken a long time to answer. "I regret the pain I caused," he had said finally, "but I do not regret the choice itself, because the alternative was allowing you to be used as leverage against me, and I would not accept that. So no, I do not regret it, but I also acknowledge that it was a terrible choice and that you have every right to be angry about it." "I was angry," Sophia had said, "for a long time, but anger requires energy, and I did not have energy to spare, so I simply survived. And now that I have time to be angry, I find that I cannot quite access it anymore." "What can you access?" Henry had asked. Sophia had thought about this carefully. "Understanding," she had said finally. "Sadness about the year we lost. Gratitude that you are alive. Fear that something like this could happen again. And beneath all of it, love. But a different kind of love than before. Not the love of discovery, but the love of survival. Not the love of passion, but the love of choice." Henry had reached for her hand. "Can you live with that kind of love?" "I think I have to," Sophia had said, "because that is all we have now. The question is whether you can." "Yes," he had said without hesitation. "Sophia, I would live with any version of you, any version of us, as long as I do not have to live without you again." That year was the longest year of my life. It taught me that there are worse things than death, and one of them is living when the person you love believes you are dead. By summer, they had found their rhythm. Henry had returned to work, and Sophia had begun to engage in society again, not as a widow in mourning, but as a woman whose husband had returned from an unexpected absence. The story, carefully managed through Mr. Brennan's connections, was that Henry had been on a confidential matter for the firm in the country. Nothing scandalous, nothing that raised too many questions. Some people believed it, some people did not. But London society, being primarily concerned with the present rather than the past, had largely accepted Henry's return without excessive comment. They had made love for the first time since his return in June. It had been tender and careful, and, Sophia had been surprised to discover, more intimate than it had been before, because they had both been tested. They had both nearly lost each other, and in the act of coming back together, they had acknowledged everything they had endured to reach that moment. In July, they had purchased a country property, not far from London, but far enough to feel like a fresh start, a place where the memories of the year they had lived together before his disappearance were not embedded in every corner. In August, Sophia had discovered that she was pregnant. She had not planned it, neither had Henry. But when she had told him, he had held her and wept, not from sorrow, but from the sheer relief of it. A future, a new life, something that belonged to both of them and to neither of them until it arrived. "We will do better," he had said, his hand on her still flat belly. "With this child, we will tell them the truth. We will not hide things. We will not allow secrets to destroy what we have built. We will try," Sophia had corrected gently. "We cannot promise to do better. We can only promise to try." On the evening before they departed for their new country home, Sophia had found the Valentine card where it had been sitting on her dressing table for months. She had looked at it, at the handwriting, at the cryptic message, at the words that had meant impossibility and had proven to be prophecy. The Italian countryside, the pale blue dress. The moment I knew, I have not forgotten. I am coming home. He had come home, not to the people they had been, but to each other. They had rebuilt from ashes. They had learned to love in a new way, a way that did not depend upon the preservation of memory, but upon the willingness to create new memories, knowing that nothing was guaranteed, that loss could come at any moment, that what they had was temporary and fragile and infinitely precious. Because of that fragility, Henry had entered the chamber and found her holding the card. "Do you still have that?" he had asked. "Yes," she had said. "I think I will keep it, to remind me that sometimes the impossible becomes possible, that people can return, that love persists even through the cruelest separations." Henry had taken the card from her hands and read it one final time. Then he had set it aside and pulled her close. "I am here," he had said. I am home, and I will spend the rest of my life, however long that is, proving that this was worth the price we both paid. I know, Sophia had whispered. I think I have always known. Even when I was mourning you, even when I was learning to live without you, some part of me was waiting for this, waiting for you to come home.